Hello, and welcome to this meeting of the Barbados Genealogy Group. I greet participants joining us on Zoom, as well as those on Facebook Live. I hope that you're all doing well in this continuing COVID environment. My name is Harriet Pierce, and I am the coordinator of the group. I'm extremely happy this evening to welcome 4 panelists who will explore over 100 years of the Barbados-Liberia connection. We have historian Dr. Carrie Banton, who is joining us from Arkansas. She authored a book entitled More Auspicious Shores, Barbadian Migration to Liberia, Blackness and the Making of the Liberian Republic, 1865 to 1912. We also have anthropologist Dr. Matthew Riley, who has conducted significant archaeological research in Barbados and has authored the book, Archaeology Below the Cliff, Race, Class, and Red Legs in Barbadian Sugar Society. We also have 2 descendants of the Barbadians who went to Liberia in 1865, historian Shireen Smith and retired diplomat Lorenzo Llewellyn Witherspoon. Welcome, everyone. In our talk today, as I said, we will explore the Barbados-Liberia connection. In 1865, 346 Barbadians left Bridgetown aboard the Cora for the newly established West African nation of Liberia. Today, we'll hear more about the significance of this migration from our panel. And given the composition of our panel, we can expect a treatment that is both scholarly and family-oriented. But before we hear from our first speaker, Dr. Banton, here are a few reminders. Remember to hold your questions until the end of the presentation. You may either type your question in the Q&A or use the raise hand feature, and we will allow you to speak on screen. Put your comments in the chat so that we can separate the questions on the comments. So with that out of the way, Dr. Banton.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Ms. Pierce, and thank you to all the viewers joining us today. It's a privilege of mine as a Afro-Caribbean person to actually be talking about this research, which to this point has been my life's work, having started it in 2008 as a graduate student at Vanderbilt University. And until, it came out in book form in 2019 through Cambridge University Press. Now, in terms of, I like to tell a story about, getting into this research and how I was so thrilled to find this research, again, as a Caribbean person and as a person who grew up thinking about Marcus Garvey and his Back to Africa movement, and getting to understand the circumstances under which Liberia was created, finding out that people from Barbados went to Liberia was certainly thrilling. So Matt, if you could put up that slide of, right. We have here, looking at where Barbados stand relative to Liberia. Almost immediately, you could see the connection across the Atlantic as if it was some kind of a siren call, right? So getting to think about that, in the context of the Black Atlantic, and thinking about Liberia, which was created originally for African Americans, and indeed numerous African Americans went there. Getting to add the Caribbean wrinkle in that for me was very fascinating. As a scholar who studies, the abolitionist movement, what was happening in post-emancipation. This was certainly, an interesting facet to think about Caribbean people who were dissatisfied with what the British had given them for post-emancipation, and decided to take it upon themselves to cross the Atlantic and to go not to Sierra Leone, which was the British crown colony, but to go to an independent republic at the time. Liberia got its independence in 1847, and to join hands with other Black people to create a republic, which they noted in one of the documents that I found in my research. I had to, go do research not only at the Barbados Museum, but also at Caveville, at the archives, at the public library, but also in England, also in Bloomington, Indiana, at the National Archives, but in one of their documents that I found after I discovered the initial letter, which I found, which was a colonizationist writing to the Barbadians, responding to their interest in going to Liberia. When I eventually found the letter that the Barbadians wrote back, they said that they were interested in going to Liberia for two specific reasons. And they said they wanted to build themselves up by diligent labor. Right. And the second was that they wanted to help to create a Black republic without which the Black race would never gain respectability. Right. So nationhood was in the imagination of these Caribbean post-emancipation people. Right. And that was not something that the British had thought about when they had thought about, OK, we're going to pass the Emancipation Act. What would Black people like? Right. And so here they are, they've found out about Barbados, and they found about Liberia, and they want to go across. Matt, could you switch, please? And so in 1865, then, after, suffering 30 years of what I would call the failed post-emancipation that was not of their own making, right? Nobody in Britain from Whitehall called and asked these Barbadians, right? What would you like your freedom to be? Would you like land? Would you like higher wages? Would you like citizenship? And as we all know, people like Samuel Prescott, London born, had been in this struggle for rights for Afro-Barbadians for a very long time, right? So in 1865, after, all the struggles that Samuel Prescott had made, I found a letter that said that, we ought to move to more auspicious shores, right? Leaving behind the land for the tyrants who claim it as their own, right? And certainly those who will remain, people like Prescott, will continue the diligent work, but we're going to more auspicious shores. So in 1865, they travel across the Atlantic and they make their way into Liberia. They get to Liberia, and of course, they join a wide cross section of other Black people who had come there under numerous conditions of unfreedom. There were the native indigenous Africans of over 14 ethnic groups who were already, the Bassa, the Kru, were living in that area, right? There were the African Americans who the colony was created to essentially deport African Americans to Liberia. And then there was a group called recaptive Africans who were liberated from slave ships and put in Liberia. And now the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean people were now being added. So 4 group of people in what I'm calling a kind of Afropolitan setting has joined together to create this republic that will gain the Black race respectability. Matt, could you get to the next slide? And so here I have a list that was indeed, such a huge part of my research. I found this list in the African Repository of the Immigrants from Barbados. This is the ship manifest that the American Colonization Society filled out. And if you can notice, as a historian, I look at this list and I look at, you have here the name, you have the age, you have the occupation, you have the religion, and you ask yourself, why are they interested in those kinds of categories, right? For the immigrants, right? But I went to Barbados finding out who these individuals are. Were they baptized? Where did they live, right? What kind of community? Which church did they go? What kind of kinship relationships did they have, right? So it's much more beyond these details that was important for the American colonization society that they were taken with them over to Liberia. So if you scoot down, Matt, you'll see the number of migrants there. At the time that I was researching, my advisor was Richard Blackett, who had put me in touch with scholars in Barbados, Woodville Marshall being one of them, where I could find out and do a lot of this research. But I found Blackett in the list of names, and Blackett is from Trinidad. And so he's like, all the Caribbean people are essentially from Barbados, because Barbados, as we well know, was migrating in droves everywhere, from the new frontier territories in Trinidad to the Padma Canal to Brazil, and of course to Liberia. So you can go through all of that, Matt, and to see all the occupations: planter, carpenter, millwright, trader, all of that. You could keep scooting down, and just the 50 different families. Prominent names, of course, Padmores, Graves, Blackman, Moors, all the typical Barbadian names that, resonate with us, and of course the religion, Moravian, Anglican, and that's interesting too, right? In terms of Episcopalian, Anglican, there were ports, of course, yes, who were there. We'll talk about the ports. One of the speakers will talk about the ports later on. Right, so they get to Liberia, and what do they do? Right, they're given their plots of land, and they proceed to start to make a remarkable contribution to the Liberian Republic. Up here you see the 15th president of Liberia, President Arthur Barkley. I believe your Prime Minister Motley referred to him as perhaps the first Afro-Barbadian Prime Minister, right? So we know that Barbados would get its independence later on, but here is a Barbadian transplanted to Liberia. He arrived in Liberia when he was very young. His father actually led the expedition, Anthony Barkley. And here is his son, Arthur Barkley, who becomes Prime Minister at the turn of the century, right? And so Barbadians would make significant contribution in Liberia, particularly playing a significant role in government, in education, right? As I mentioned earlier, the Padmores, the ports, would play significant role in government, and make a numerous contribution in various aspects of Liberian political life. Scoot down, Matt. Right, and all of this is creating, for scholars like me, thinking about the ways in which the African diaspora being gathered there in Liberia are coming together and transforming how we're thinking about what Blackness is. If we have Caribbean people in Liberia, if we have African-American people, if we have African recaptives and indigenous Africans, who gets to define what Blackness is? Here we have the ship on which J.J. Roberts had gone over to Barbados in 1848 to speak to the Barbadians to come over to Liberia to come and join the Republic. And so certainly you could think about with this photograph how somebody like Anthony Barkley, who was leading this expedition, right? He actually may have envisioned himself becoming a leader of this Black Republic. Unfortunately, he was one of the first casualties of the expedition. He died shortly after he arrived. But as I said, his son went on to become president at the turn of the 20th century. So here we have all these Barbadians, African Americans, Indigenous Africans, African recaptives in the Liberian nation, not only defining their terms of freedom, what citizenship would look like, but also race as in a different way than they had experienced it, whether across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, or in the United States. They're experiencing race and particularly Blackness differently in Liberia, right? And so the last slide, Matt. This is the just to give you a tally of the number of ships that would arrive in Liberia that year. And you see the different place. So all of them are coming from the United States, and only one ship is coming to Liberia from the Caribbean in 1865. So that tells you how much the Barbadian migrants to Liberia stand out, especially at that time when the Civil War is going on and African Americans are looking to a brighter future in the United States, what kind of mark that the Barbadians would make. Next slide, Matt. Right, so again, those are the ships heading to Liberia. And again, as I mentioned, the kinds of engagement in politics that the Barbadians would have in terms of their relationships with Barbadians, the relationship with the British, who were on in Sierra Leone, which is right on the border of Liberia, the relationship with African recaptives, who they would have to train as a part of the nation building process of building up the nation so that the nation could get its respectability. And so ultimately, what we can learn from the Barbadian-Liberian connection as it relates to this group that went in 1865, right, is that their narrative does not necessarily fit the other groups that had gone there from numerous other states, whether it's Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, or other places in the United States. But as a Caribbean group of people who were from a British background, they were carrying different ideas, different ways of thinking, foods, right? Whether it's breadfruit or the sugar cane. In fact, the Barbadians were deeply lauded for their industriousness, that they would come and the reason why they would help to build up the nation was that they had this particular set of skills. Barbadians were known to be the most industrious set of people in this side of in the Black Atlantic world. So there are other things that we could talk about, but I'll leave that for the Q&A, and I will just end my portion of the talk and save the rest for later on.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And for those interested, here's a photo of the front cover of Carrie's marvelous book, which, as she mentioned, came out in 2019. So personally, I'm just very much indebted to all of the hard work that she's done. And in many ways, a lot of what we're talking about today is very much inspired by this ongoing work that she continues to play a pivotal role in. So to begin with, I'm going to be very, very brief, partly because all of you here would much more rather hear from our other panelists. And secondly, because this is very much not my story. I'm an outsider in a number of different ways to this project and to this story. So first and foremost, I'm just very grateful to be allowed to be part of this conversation. And I'm so grateful to Carrie for her partnership, but also to Shireen and Lorenzo as well for so warmly welcoming me into these very intimate family stories and into this Crozierville community. And in fact, in the attendance list, I see a number of other members of that Crozierville community. So thank you so much for your openness. So as Harriet mentioned during the introductions, I've built a lot of my archaeological career not working in West Africa, but in Barbados. And as a result of that, over the last several years, you can see some shameless self-promotion here with the two books, but if you're interested in Barbadian archaeology, please feel free to take a look. But over those years, I've become introduced to a very kind of interesting Caribbean landscape of the 19th century. And as a result of that, I started thinking more critically about issues related to colonialism, race, and freedom making throughout the Atlantic world. And it was at the time of doing my postdoctoral fellowship that I had the good fortune to meet Carrie just as she was finishing up her own book project on the Barbadians who left for Liberia in 1865. And it was in that moment that we decided to think through what a collaborative project might look like, which eventually did take us to Liberia. And it's at a very auspicious moment in 2022 that we're having this conversation on this particular day. And it's partly because Liberia itself is going through an interesting moment of commemoration. In 1822, so we're at the 200th year anniversary of the first arrival of African-American settlers of what would become known as Providence Island. And it's the 175th anniversary of the making of the Liberian Republic. So in anticipation of this reflective year, Korea and I, with a number of collaborators in Liberia and the United States, began what we've officially called the Back to Africa Heritage and Archaeology Project, which more broadly looks at different sites of settlement from a historical perspective, but also from an archaeological perspective, which is my own specialty and forte. So it's in that context that we began exploring different sites related to the Back to Africa movement, including Providence Island, the township of Edina, which you'll hear a little bit about later from Lorenzo, and then of course the township of Crozierville, which was really the first space that we were interested in exploring and thinking through what that community means from a heritage standpoint. So you can see the seal of Liberia on the left and the locations of the 3 sites that we've been studying over the last few years. But given today's topic, I did want to emphasize the location of Crozierville, located upriver along the St. Paul River from Monrovia, neighboring a number of other settlement communities that had been there prior to the establishment or the arrival of the Barbadians in 1865. And a lot of this will just set the stage for what Shireen and Lorenzo will introduce in just a moment. So here you can see the welcome sign that was built on the centennial occasion of the Crozierville settlement. So it was erected in 1965 by some of the descendant community members in Crozierville who were still living there at the time, and some of whom who are now located elsewhere in Liberia or elsewhere in the diaspora. Here you can see the monument that was erected on this momentous occasion of the 100th anniversary with some of the commemorative text that you can see here at the bottom of your screen. And I should note here that this welcome sign and monument is what greets you as you enter Crozierville and pass down what is still known as Lemongrass Street, which you'll hear all about in just a few moments. But from my perspective, one of the elements that I'm hoping to be able to contribute here is a perspective that's informed by material culture and the landscape, thinking through what archaeology might offer. And so part of that process is thinking through what's often left out of the archive. So here you're looking at an aerial view of Lemongrass Street, trying to piece together what the community may have looked like from the earliest days of settlement, beginning in 1865, when some of those Bajans first arrived in this area that was largely forested, but absolutely still inhabited by a number of different indigenous groups and some neighboring settler communities as well. So here you get a sense of what the aerial landscape looks like today. But we're also trying to reconstruct what the community would have looked like when it was most vibrant. And you're going to hear all about some of that from Shireen and Lorenzo very shortly. We're piecing together where individual families would have lived along Lemongrass Street, and hopefully going to be expanding this map outwards to think through where families were living on the outskirts of the community as well. And as Karee mentioned, you can see some familiar Bajan names along that Lemongrass Street that's featured here from a satellite image. So part of what we're trying to do is think through the Barbadian influence in Crozierville. And part of our work has been to map some of the still standing architecture. What you're looking at here are 2 of the homes built by different families. I believe this is a home that was built by the Goodrich family on the left. You'll hear more about that from Shireen momentarily. And then a home built by the McGill family on the right. And while many scholars have pointed out the African-American influence on Liberian architecture, there is far less understood about the West Indian influence. And in fact, here on the bottom of your screen, you're looking at the Bajan influence directly. You can see here the humble chattel house from Barbados on the bottom right, and Bagatelle Great House on the bottom left, which is located in the parish of St. Thomas, where many of the Barbadian migrants would have been coming from. So we're trying to think through the architectural influences as well. And for those of you both joining us from both Liberia and Barbados, you would of course know exactly what you're seeing here. But as someone who worked in Barbados for many years, I guess it shouldn't have come as a surprise. But as you go down Lemongrass Street, it's every single house is marked by the individual family's breadfruit tree, which is still kind of a central place in the household organization. So here's one that has fallen off the branch, but the landscape is dotted by many of these trees. So we're thinking about foodways in terms of the Barbadian influence. So over the last few years, we've been excavating at a couple of different sites around Crozierville, including pictured here, the Padmore household. You'll hear more about the Padmores momentarily. And we're trying to think through what the material culture tells us about the everyday lives of some of these settlers and then some of their descendants. So we're recovering the pieces of everyday life, a meaningful representation about what life in Crozierville would have been like, and often some of those things that are left out of the archival record. But of course, most importantly, from the outset for Corrie and I, this was going to be a community engaged project where we've been very grateful to have the kind of collaborative networks that have been generated over the last few years. And that's partially to due to the warm, welcoming environment that we've received from Shireen Smith and to Lorenzo Witherspoon, who have really been just so dynamic as part of this broader project, things that they've been working on for generations in their own families. So as I turn things over to Shireen, I do want to thank her again for pointing us in the right direction, politely or correcting us when we're incorrect in some of our own research. But this to us has really been one of the most rewarding aspects of this collaboration, to hear stories from this community when it was at its most vibrant. So it's with that I'll turn things over to Shireen, and thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, and I want to thank the Barbados Museum and Historical Society for the invitation to participate in this forum today. Please pardon me for reading from my prepared notes because I can get very passionate about Crozierville, and I don't want to go off script within the time frame we've been allotted. I'm delighted to be here and to share with your viewing audience a brief synopsis on the lives of the Goodriches and the Padmores. The Barbadians who settled in Crozierville came together as a community, and they laid the groundwork for our success. We all have tremendous admiration and gratitude for the sacrifices made by them. If they had not given us that strong foundation and sense of community, we would never have survived the drastic turn of events that took place in Liberia during the 80s and the 90s. I was asked to speak specifically about the Goodriches and the Padmores. I'm related to and grew up with many of the families from Barbados that settled in Crozierville. For example, the Holders, the Eastmans, the Weeks, the Morris, and the Ports. Just last week, on May 10th, Crozierville celebrated 157 years of existence since those brave men, women, and children left Barbados, came across the Atlantic, and arrived in Liberia. First slide, please, Matt. This is the St. Paul River. The Goodriches and the Padmores traveled the St. Paul River from Monrovia, the capital city of Liberia, to Crozierville. This river became the main route of transportation for them for many years before paved roads were built. The people who lived up the St. Paul River are sometimes referred to as up the river people. In Liberia, when referring to up the river people, we're not referring to any other river. We're talking about the residents in communities who lived up the banks of the St. Paul River. The Barbadians were known as up the river people. I say this because being referred to as up the river meant certain things. For example, it meant the up the river people had certain standards. They had a particular way of doing things. They were no nonsense people. They were hard workers and they were industrious. You might hear somebody say, I'm looking for an up the river girl to marry. That was because she was well trained, she had certain values, and she would make an excellent partner. Next slide, please. This is a short video of Crozierville. The land they received when they would arrive, like Matt has said previously, was just all forest. So this is what it would have looked like. They wasted no time clearing the land and immediately started to build and creating a community. Next slide, please, Matt. Actually, it's the monument, but we'll go. When I grew up in Crosserville, it was a vibrant community. The Barbadian families who settled in Crosserville came together as one. They built their homes and churches, schools. They had a clinic and wasted no time turning the land given to them into huge agricultural enterprises. Most of the families had farms. However, there were quite a few of the men who had jobs in the city and came home to Crosserville on the weekends. The women helped to run these farms and businesses. They were the backbone of the community. The women were great quilt makers. The quilts that they made, they sold them in the city, and sometimes those quilts were presented as gifts by the president to visiting dignitaries. The monument was built and dedicated in 1969 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the forefathers who arrived in Crosserville. I was a schoolgirl in Crosserville in 1969, and the centennial celebration was a week-long event. Dignitaries arrived from all over. We, the school children, we had to put on our new uniforms and march in the parade. All the houses and the buildings were repainted, and it was such a grand affair. The Barbadians had actually done it. They had arrived, they were successful, and they were making a goal in Liberia. In addition to their private enterprises, they held permanent positions throughout the government, fulfilling the original goal of President Daniel B. Warner, that they return to their motherland and help in building the new Republic, Liberia. The Goodriches were one of the families that became instrumental in Liberia's nation building. Next slide, please. We'll stay on this slide for now, Matt. Cornelia Amelia Goodrich. This is the manifest from the Quora. Cornelia Amelia Goodrich, Judith Ann Goodrich, Mary John Goodrich, William Henry Goodrich, and James Abel Goodrich. These were the Goodriches listed on the Quora. Next slide, Matt. Okay. Now, James Abel Goodrich was the youngest Goodrich on the Quora. He was 15 when his family arrived in Liberia. James Abel Goodrich had two sons. This was the first generation that was born in Liberia. Their two sons were James M.D. Goodrich and Shepherd Goodrich. Shepherd had several children, including Ishmael, Lenora, Annette, and Asilia. All of these children have passed away. James M.D. Goodrich was a tailor, like his father, James Abel. He married Nancy Garnett from Bensonville. Next slide, please. The Goodrich Brothers. The Goodrich Brothers, this is the second generation that was born in Liberia after they arrived from Barbados. So the sons of James M.D. Goodrich are, from left to right, the youngest. Richmond Bethel, who became a banker and also had a few businesses. He is now in his 80s and he is living in the US. He is the only son that is still alive. Richmond was a city boy. All of his young nieces and nephews loved hanging out at his home in Monrovia. He was also the only son who never went into farming and the only son who never built a home in Crosserville. The next son is Amos Goodrich. He became an engineer with the Department of Public Works. He was smart and always very serious. He managed many of Liberia's road construction projects. He built a beautiful home in Crosserville, and I think Matt showed you a picture of that home earlier on. And this home was next to his brother's house. And it is one of the only remaining original houses that's still standing today. Amos died about 10 years ago and is buried on his farm in Totota. James Wilfred Goodrich, he started his career as a tailor. like his father and his grandfather. He's the one in the middle. He went on to study law and was an attorney in the Carisburg district. He was also a farmer, and he built a home in Kosovo. One of his daughters recently built a home on the original spot of his house. I remember that he smoked a pipe, and he always was pleasant and kind. James is buried in Rhode Island in the United States. John Edmund Goodrich was a commercial farmer, a businessman, and a lifelong Baptist. He was the only brother who was not a Methodist. He built a house in Kosovo, and that house is still standing. Following the war in Liberia, he relocated to the US, and he is also buried in Rhode Island. Everett Jonathan Goodrich, the last son on your right, or to the right. There was never any misunderstanding about who headed the Goodrich family. Their father, James Andy, had died many years before, and most of his grandchildren were even born. Their mother, Nancy, was now married to Jacob Padma. The mantle of leadership and the responsibility of caring for others was what characterized and molded Everett's life. The brothers were very tight, and they remained close to their mother and stepfather until they passed away. Next slide, please, Matt. This is Charles Goodrich. He's the only brother who was not in that group picture. He owned several farms and became a builder. He was also good at making furniture. He built a home in Kosovo and relocated to the US during the Liberian Civil War. Charles died in Rhode Island, but was buried in Kosovo. Next slide, please, Matt. Jonathan Everett Goodrich, during his early career, and I'll spend a little time on him and you'll understand why. During his earlier career, he was a popular instructor at the College of West Africa and also worked with a printing office. In answering the needs of the community, he later established a trucking and transportation company, a repair shop, and he owned several rental properties. The Liberian Official Gazette that you see on the screen, they wrote about him stating, although a highly successful businessman, at the request of President William V.S. Tubman, he joined the government in 1951 as Inspector of Counties in Liberia. He later received a grant to travel to the US and study the operations of local government in rural and urban areas. This training later equipped him to serve his country as cabinet minister for local government and rural reconstruction in President William R. Talbot's government. Previously, in 1954, he had been President Tubman's principal administrative assistant, responsible for carrying out extensive, detailed investigations into the rights of large numbers of Liberian citizens. He had a canny ability of being able to resolve conflicting and competing interests to the satisfaction of most, if not all, parties involved. Next slide, please, Matt. This is Everett on the right, next to President Tubman, with the tie and standing there. Because of these many qualities, in 1968, he was elevated to the trustworthy position of Cabinet Secretary for National Defense by President Tubman. This responsibility he shouldered and executed with great courage, profound dignity, and immense ability. Next slide, please, Matt. He also served as vice chairman of the Goodrich Party. Next slide, please. There he is with Vice President Green, and these are members of the Goodrich Party, which at that time was the ruling party in Liberia. Next slide, please, Matt. Everett held a lot of power, but I can tell you that he was not the type of politician who would say, do you know who I am? That was not him. Next slide, please, Matt. He educated a lot of Liberians and provided financial support to a large number of people. A government housing estate was named for him. He was well loved by his family and the people of Liberia. He was also well respected, trusted, and admired by both President Padma and Talbot. President Talbot was at his bedside just hours before his death. Everett Jonathan Goodrich died in 1976 in Liberia, and he's buried in Kosovo. All of the Goodrich brothers learned and spoke the local dialect, Pele. Next slide, please, Matt. This is a short clip of Reeves Memorial Methodist Church. This was the church home of the Holders, the Goodriches, the Reeves, and the Weeks family, among other families. The land for the church was donated by the Reeves family. The original church was a wooden structure. This church was a gathering place. The Moravia families would come up to Kosovo on the weekends, and all of the families would fellowship together. The cemetery is directly behind the church, and that is where most of our ancestors are buried. Next slide, please, Matt. That's just another shot of the church, and we can move on to the next one. Before the coup, the various wars, and before the families left Kosovo for other parts of the world, there were beautiful, well-kept modern homes that lined both sides of Lemongrass Street in Kosovo. Sunday afternoon was for visiting families. People went for strolls up and down Lemongrass Street. What they call it, they'll say, I want to go walk up, we're going to go walk about. The food they prepared was like what I had when I visited Barbados. We make cod fish stew, like the saltfish dish that I had in Barbados. We had breadfruit, edos, cassava, rice and peas, sugar cane, plums, and all the same foods that I've seen in Barbados. The land in Kosovo is beautiful. It was a vibrant community where lots of events were held. Children walked to school, picking and eating plums, oranges, and bananas along the way. We didn't have a care in the world. Today, folks who did not have an opportunity to visit Kosovo back in the day, or even the younger generation, they think of Kosovo as a backwards place. Kosovo started off with kerosene lamps and kerosene refrigerators, and in later years, when I was growing up, we had electricity around the clock. Some of the homes had outhouses, and some of the homes had indoor plumbing. This is the exterior of Everett J. Goodrich home in the 70s that he built in Kosovo. Next slide, please. So you wonder why she's showing us these shots, but I'm sharing these slides because I want to provide you with a glimpse of what life was back in the 70s in Kosovo. Here's an example of a Kosovo wedding in the 70s. And this was at Reeves Memorial Methodist Church that you just saw on the screen. This is not an exception. The Barbadians had beautiful, well-kept homes, no matter the size, big or small. Next slide, please. And this is the bride, Comfort Lawrence, arriving with her dad, James Wilfred Goodrich. And we can go to the next one. You see, this is the interior of Reeves Memorial Methodist Church at that time. There's Comfort and her father, James Wilfred Goodrich. Next slide. Another shot of the church in the interior of Reeves Memorial. And this is interesting because this is the inside of the residence of Everett Jonathan Goodrich home that you just saw on the screen. And this was in the 70s. So this gives you a flavor of what these homes look like inside. To tell you that this was a real thriving community that was coming up. This was where they held the reception of the wedding reception. Next slide, please. And you can see they had local dishes. There's a whole pig on the table, and it was a nice event. And weddings were similar to this. The whole community came together to celebrate. We can go on to the next one. And this is just to give you a flavor. And next slide. So this is a picture of the Goodrich family reunion that they held in 2009 in the US. Most of the families who are from Crusoeville who now live abroad hold regular family reunions. The Weeks family visited Barbados and had plans for a reunion in Barbados in 2020. But because of the pandemic, these plans are now on pause, and I'm sure they plan to go to return to go to Barbados for their reunion. Next slide, please. Christ Episcopal Church is the church home of the Torps, the Ports, Padmos, Eastmans, and other families. The original church was built on Port Hill, and I'm sure Lorenzo will talk about that later, and that is where their cemetery is located. Next slide, please. This is the ship manifest for the Padma family. And next slide, please. And this is a portion of the Padma family tree. Jacob Padma was a farmer, and he traveled with his wife, Lucretia Padma. They arrived in Liberia on the Great Cora from Barbados with 8 children, including George Stanley Padma, who was 14 years old, and James B. Padma, who was 19. Because of time, I will briefly discuss only James and George and some of their descendants. Colonel James B. Padma brought the Gola War in Crusoeville to an end. I learned recently from his great-grandson that the B in his name stood for Bethel. James had a son, and we call him, I knew his son, we call him Cousin Trudy Padma. He was very old when I knew him. He lived in Bensonville, which is another settlement founded by immigrants from the US. Cousin Trudy Padma had a school in Bensonville. George Stanley Padma fought twice in the Kipamas War, and his granddaughter, who is now in her 90s, she remembers attending his funeral as a child, and she remembered that he had only one arm. She said he had lost his arm in the war. The children of George Stanley Padma was the first generation born in Liberia. I'll speak briefly about his oldest son and his youngest son. Jerome Padma was the oldest of the Padma boys. He was a businessman. Oh, next slide, please. I'm sorry, Matt. There you go. Jerome Padma was the oldest of the Padma boys. He was a businessman. He traveled to Europe and imported fine goods and clothing to Liberia. His niece, who is now in her 90s, remembers him well and have a few stories about him. Next slide, please. This is Nancy and Jacob Padma. Jacob A. Padma is most remembered by me as the original Padma historian. I grew up in the Padma house and was raised there from a baby until I was 11. I was always with my grandfather. I remember he would sit in his chair, and I would sit on the steps by his feet and listen to him tell me stories about his family. He told me about each of his siblings, their travels to different countries, how they died. One brother worked for the State Department and died in Spain, and he's buried there. 2 of his other brothers died in boating accidents. And he was my link to the generation before him. Next slide, please, Matt. This is the Padma house where I grew up. The Padma house was his parents' house that was passed down to him. I remember there was a large canopy bed that was dripped with white netting that my grandmother slept in. And he told me that that bed had belonged to his mother. I never got tired of listening to him and loved hearing all the stories. My grandfather, Jacob A. Padma, became an expert in understanding and resolving native disputes. He was superintendent of the Native Appellate Court at the Interior Department. He negotiated several truces between tribes, earning their respect. Jacob lived at my father's house in Monrovia during the week and went up to Crusoeville on the weekends. His wife, Nancy, was a pillar in the community and spearheaded many community events. Bear with me, let me tell you this little story about Jacob. Jacob was always well-dressed. When he walked into a room, everyone took notice. One of his oldest family members told me that When they were building the main road through Crusoeville, all the men in the community helped with the digging and the shoveling and the hard work. However, Jacob walked around the project in his dress suit with his white shirt on and cufflinks, with his hands behind his back, and he acted like he was the supervisor. I believed her because my grandfather never liked getting his hands dirty, and he was always very proper. Jacob worked for the Interior Department until the day he died. I remember his final weeks he spent with our family. Next slide, please. He died in 1971 and is buried at Christ Church Cemetery in Crusoeville. His wife Nancy passed away about a year and a half earlier. A caretaker was brought in to upkeep the house in Crusoeville. Jacob never remarried. Next slide, please. Antoinette Padma, the great-granddaughter of George Stanley Padma, was the first lady of Liberia. Her father was James Padma, and her mother was the granddaughter of President Otter Barclay, who's down on the right. Both she and her brother lost their parents at an early age, and they were raised by relatives. George specifically was raised by President and Mistress Edwin Barclay, and that's President Edwin Barclay directly under the picture of Antoinette Padma. And Antoinette was raised by the Sherman and the Wilds before joining her brother to stay with the Barclays, who raised them as their own children. Antoinette went to school in France. She was actively involved in social causes and established the Antoinette Padma Child Welfare Foundation and the Catherine Mills Rehabilitation Center. Next slide, please, Matt. Mrs. Padma represented her country around the world. During her world travels, she exemplified elegance and poise, and when she met with kings and queens and the Pope. The sports stadium in Liberia was named in her honor. Next slide, please, Matt. The citizens of Crusoeville honored her by naming the community school after her. Next slide, please, Matt. That was a little video, but that's okay. Antoinette died in 2011, and she is buried in Liberia. Next slide, please, Matt. Her brother, George Arthur Padma Sr., was the Liberian ambassador to Washington when in 1960 he presided over the United Nations Security Council during the Congo crisis. Next slide, please, Matt. George was the founder of the Liberia Amusement Limited, and they built the Liberian cinema called the modern Liberian cinema called the Relda that's located in Cinco, was located in Cinco, Monrovia. In addition, they operated over 20 brick and mortar theaters and had mobile movie vans that went to various counties showing films. He married Edith Mae Wiles, that was on the picture next to him, whose ancestors came to Liberia from Barbados. She held an administrative post at the Executive Mansion. President William R. Tauber appointed her as the very first female cabinet minister in the Republic of Liberia. She was the Minister of Health. Next slide, please. This is the picture of President William R. Tauber's cabinet. And in this picture, there are 3 Barbadians, so you can see how prominent they were in contributing to the Republic. Everett Jonathan Goodrich and Rushford L. Weeks, who was Foreign Minister. And then the only female in that picture is Edith Mae Wiles. She was smart, she was hardworking, and she could stand up to any of those men who were in that picture. Next slide, please. This is Leona Padma Hannah. She is the granddaughter of George Stanley Padma. She is in her 90s now, and she's the oldest living Padma from the Barbadian group. She has always been a valuable resource on the Padma family history. Next slide now. This is Leona's father, Abel Padma, on the left. He was an attorney who practiced law in Liberia. This photo was taken in Germany where he met her mother before Leona was born. The gentleman next to him is Mr. William E. Dennis. Next slide, please. Now, this is George Otter Padma Jr. He was a gem. I cannot say enough about him because it will take all day. He was loved by every generation of relatives. He was a true family man and a very dear friend to many. Otter was determined that this generation and the generations to come know our ancestors and appreciate our history. He was well versed in Liberian history. It was because of his love for Liberian history that we started to document the oral history of the Barbadian descendants who settled in Crosserville and parts of Liberia. Over several years, he provided hours of recording for this documentary. Sadly, Otter passed away a year ago. During his final days, even when he was in pain and discomfort, he was resilient. He got out of bed and he continued to interview for the Barbadians in Crosserville documentary film. This was truly inspiring. Later this year, we will be releasing the documentary on the oral history of the families who came from Barbados and their descendants who settled in Crosserville and who are now living all over the world. We may not all reside in the same geographic areas, but the families continue to be supportive and we share a very strong bond. We spent many years on this project. My first visit to Barbados was in 2012 to research our ancestors. The documentary has brought together several generations of families representing almost every family from Barbados that settled in Crosserville and some in Monrovia. Here is a short clip of the video from the upcoming documentary film. The first person you will see is Dawn Padma, the daughter of Otter Padma. I thank you for your time. Now oh.
On Isaac Alexander Weeks.
Now, can you start from the beginning? Then we missed the whole sound. To our distant Bajan cousins in the country of Barbados, that our ancestors waved farewell to over 157 years ago. The good news is their descendants are survivors. We greet you with joy and happiness.
My name is Ophelia Ines Weeks. Well, my father is Rushford Lafayette Weeks. He's the Crosservillian. My mother is Euphemie Geraldine Cooper Weeks. She's originally from Kipelmas. And my grandfather, John Isaac Alexander Weeks, or Reverend John Isaac Alexander Weeks, was the only child of his parents. His mother and father were on the brig Cora that landed in Liberia in 1865. His mother was, I think, about 7 or 8 years old, and his father was 6. So they were on that ship with their parents. So naturally, my grandfather is a Weeks, and his wife is a Thorpe, I think it is. Her name was Elsa Dorinda Thor, and her husband, my grandfather's father, was Daniel. My grandfather was a farmer. He was a pastor. He was a teacher. He wasn't a wealthy man. He wasn't a tall man. He was a really short man. But he was tall and wealthy in his perspective on life and his insistence and the importance of a good education. He also instilled in his children's head and in their minds that to be successful, especially since you're not wealthy, you needed to have a good education. Nobody could ever take that away from you. And hard work was essential. What a lot of people don't know, they think that we come from a wealthy family, but we do not. My father and his brothers went to school barefooted, and they had to walk a couple of miles. And before they went to school, they had chores that they had to do, like work on the farm and work on the land. I got an undergraduate degree in microbiology, then went to Howard University in Washington, DC, received a PhD in neuroanatomy, and then went to Emory University in Atlanta and was a postdoctoral fellow there for...
This is one of my favorite pictures. This is a picture of my grandfather, the grandson of Samuel Tappan Holder. So my father is to the left, and he was named after his grandfather, Samuel. The middle is Richard, his brother, and Harry is to the right, his other brother. So there were three brothers, Richard, Sam, and Harry. And you're probably wondering what this is, but I can tell you how excited I was when I saw this list. And I saw passenger 182, passenger 183, 184, 185. My great-great-grandfather, Samuel Tappan Holder, Susanna Jane Holder, Nathaniel Holder, my grandfather, actually my great-grandfather, and Margaret Ann Holder. Hello, my name is Versia Holder Davis. I am the great-granddaughter of Nathaniel Holder.
I'm Bernice Eastland. My father, Nathan Eastland, and Crucial was the son of Thomas Edmund Eastland. And my grandfather, what I can remember about him, he was an accomplished farmer. He had a farm that they called My Pig. And he had workers on the farm, and he planted everything on that farm: coffee, sugarcane, and cocoa, and everything that you can imagine, coffee. And so he was one that was very industrial in that business. He made sugarcane alcohol, he made syrup, he made brown sugar, and he exported these things to Germany. He had a warehouse where he kept his things, and he exported them to Germany. And from Germany, he exported things that he needed
he imported things that he needed in crucial.
Lorenzo, we now turn things over to you. Thank you so much, Shireen. Lorenzo, you're still muted.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all of you, wherever you are. Thanks for joining this webinar. I think I have learned a lot already from Shireen's presentation. She's covered Cruiserville in ways that I couldn't, basically because as a consequence of the several civil wars that Liberia encountered, and the fact that our family homestead in Cruiserville was collapsed during the war, and also the fact that the family newspaper, the Daily Observer, was burnt, and the library containing all the papers and all the every historical artifact that we had was destroyed. We don't have the fortune of having some of the critical, important information that we need to have. What I do have is, in fact, to tell the audience that my connection with Barbados begins with my great-great-grandfather, John Prince Port, who was on the Cora in 1865. He died in Liberia in 1890. One of his sons, he came with 7 children to Liberia in 1865. One of his sons, who was born in Liberia, Reverend Conrad Cuslet Port, was my great-grandfather. He died in 1926 and is buried in Cruiserville. My grandmother, Lillian Port Best, who was married to George Stanfield Best, who it is said came from Trinidad, but I was corrected by Prime Minister Martley when I visited Barbados last year, say that actually the Bests in Trinidad came from Barbados. So maternally or paternally, we have this Caribbean blood, whether it's 100% Barbadian or whether it's 50% Barbadian, 50% Trinidadian on my grandfather's side. It's just the way it is. My mother, Beryl Inez Best Brewer, after whom my daughter Lois is named, was the brains behind the project that we did last year to document the Port family Cruiserville life, if you will. She was studying in Canada at the time at McGill University when some of her friends, classmates, tried to conscript her to the Caribbean Club. And she says, well, look, I'm not Caribbean. And they said, Lois, look at you, listen to you. What do you mean you're not Caribbean? Then she suddenly remembered that I had told her what my grandmother told me about her grandfather and the fact that we do have Caribbean blood. But by the time I was born, my grandparents had long left Cruiserville. First to Calcutta after my grandmother married Mr. Best, my grandfather, as she called him. Mr. Best died in Calcutta, and then my grandmother moved to Monrovia. But even so, the homestead of the Port family in Cruiserville was heralded as both a grounding and a finishing school. And you probably already know where I'm going with this because Cherie spoke a lot about that. There was never less than about 15 occupants in that house at any given time. The house was a home, and I mean a large home. And eventually the house in Monrovia, which I will talk about later, when my grandmother moved to Monrovia after her husband died, mirrored that same house in Cruiserville. but leveraging the strict discipline Uncle Albert Port had learned from and was bequeathed by his father and grandfather, Uncle Albert was entrusted by his siblings with the task of embedding in the family's offsprings the values and virtues dubbed wholesome qualities required, indeed necessary, to contribute to society and nation building. Among these were Christianity. In our family, we have, in fact, today my uncle is a layperson in the church in Cruiserville, Kenneth Best. He still goes there every Sunday from Monrovia to church up there. Along with Christianity was ethics, was hard work, respect, courage, and resilience. Resilience because, like Dr. Weeks just said in the video, even though we're poor, we're all poor, but we were taught that because you're poor doesn't mean you have to stay poor. And with a solid and sound education and good upbringing, you can move mountains and move yourselves from wherever you are to wherever you want to be. But Bajans were very strict disciplinarians, and Uncle Albert was no exception. Believing firmly in the adage, you spoil the rod, you spare the child, he was unrelenting as he poetically chanted, beat a child until he knows. If he grumbles at the door, call him back and give him more. When he suspected that one of us had done something wrong. And Uncle Albert was always right. So it was no secret that kids from upriver were known to be of exemplary moral and ethical stock, as again, as Cherie mentioned. But so it was throughout Cruiserville, which was then akin to a village. Everybody knew everybody. Every elder was an uncle, aunt, or cousin, whether blood relatives or not. All were related. Every elder had the moral authority to discipline a child of a Bajan family found to be misbehaving while out of the house. And when you got home, your father or your mother give you another whipping because the word had already gotten to them that you were misbehaving. So kids were on their mark. I must admit, I think it's responsible. It is no doubt responsible for what a lot of us have become. The day began for Uncle Abel at about 4 a.m. with his devotion, followed by the general household devotion, including reciting the memorized collect at about 6 a.m. You had to memorize the collect every day of the week and recite it verbatim under his leadership. After that, the household chores began. Then he began his writings. As you all know, Uncle Albert Port was a prolific writer. One of his most memorable papers, and he was a pamphleteer. As a boy, those days there were stencils. He used to write his papers, type them at the house, either in Cruiserville or in Monrovia, and we will go out selling those papers. Unfortunately, we don't have those pictures of those selling those papers to show you. But one of his most famous papers, and they say he was anti-establishment. He wasn't. He was just pro-right, pro-justice, pro-good. So one of his papers that was very critical of the government of the day was thinking about unthinkable things the democratic way. Because democracy was, we had a one-party state forever. So there you go. How can you say we had democracy if the government only allowed one political party? But Uncle Albert was that advocate for moral justice, and he kept a suitcase packed, prepared, ready to go to jail. I remember when he was in Monrovia, and they would send to pick him up from the house, and my grandmother would say, "Brother," she called him brother, he called her sister. "They are here to pick you up to go to jail." He says, he would put his head out the window and say, "Tell him I'll be right there. Let me just get my bag." And they got tired of him eventually. But the vast majority of the Bajan families were Episcopalians, and others were Wesleyans, now called Methodists, and Moravians. Most settled in Cruiserville, while some stayed in Monrovia. A number of Port siblings, I think 3 brothers, moved to Grand Bassa County, where it is believed today still hosts in Edina, the city of Edina in Grand Bassa County, the largest cemetery of Bajans that returned to Liberia in 1865. I haven't been up there yet, but we have plans to go up there and to spend some time in the cemetery. And in fact, to try to do some work there and make that cemetery a heritage site of sorts. The families that remained in Cruiserville were the Brathwaites, the Capots, the Clarks, the Coxes, the Crawfords, the DeLines, the Eastmans, the Goodriches, the Hallowangas, the Holders, the Hardys, the Morris, the Padmos, the Ports, of course, the Reeveses, the Thorpes, the Weathers, the Weekses, the Wattons, and the Williamses, altogether 20. Prominent among those that went to Monrovia were the Barclays, the Grimeses, and the Walses. But regardless of where in the country the family settled, they knew and kept in touch with one another. One arrival in Liberia, each family head and each individual received 25 and 10 acres of fertile land respectively, which was shown to you from the government to develop as each chose. So not only by default, but by trade, the only thing you do with land is to farm. So every one of those forebears that came back went into farming. And of course, coming back from Barbados, some even bought, because they knew they were going to be given this land, the government had promised them that. So some of them came back with implements on the ship. Matt has shown me some of pictures of some of the implements that he found from his excavations in Liberia. The erection of Christ Church, named after the church they attended in Bridgetown, Barbados, Christ Episcopal Church, was one of the first order of business for John Prince Port and other Episcopalians in Cruiserville. The church still stands today, and my great-grandfather, who also pastored that church, was a big farmer, and he planted on his 25 acres in Cruiserville banana, ackee, breadfruit, coconut, citrus fruits, coffee, cocoa, golden plum, mango, papaya, and soursop. He also planted tubers like cassava, edos, and sweet potato, as well as green vegetables. As Matt alluded to earlier, and I think Sherry spoke of, the immigrants brought to Liberia lemongrass, which in addition to being a delicious tea, had a lot of medicinal properties. We grew it, and it served as the go-to headache medicine of choice. The main street in Cruiserville, Lemongrass Street, is named in honor of this Barbadian wonder. Perhaps Cruiserville's greatest Bajan mainstay import was and remains rum, made from sugarcane. In Liberia, we call it cane juice. It was never exported until recently, that is. It's being exported now by Mr. John T. Richardson, who started bottling it and exporting it. But Uncle Albert had his own brand of cane juice or rum, and it was called P&S, Port and Sons. That thing was 70% proof. Boy, was it strong. It was only sold in Cruiserville and locally in Monrovia. It was never exported. It was reported in the 1880s, Liberia exported sugar from sugarcane to London and Liverpool. Syrup was also made, but not commercially exploited. After my grandfather, Mr. Best, a British World War I veteran, teacher and multilingualist, died in 1945, my grandmother moved the family from Calcutta to Monrovia to a homestead bequeathed her and her uncle Albert by their mother, Frederica Port. Frederica was a king who was married to Mr. Port, and she inherited the property from a cousin who was a dentist who had died without any direct heirs. So Uncle Abbott ceded his share to her in exchange for the Cruzerville homestead. But both pieces of property remain common to both descendants, because at the time, Cruzerville didn't have a high school. So once the kids got to high school age, they all came to Monrovia, and we all lived in the house on Snapper Hill. And vice versa, we all went to Cruzerville to go to school there or to live there or during the holidays when we needed to be straightened up, as Uncle Abbott called it, when we were not conforming. In Calcutta, Mr. Best had used a 10-acre plot of land given to him by the government as in coming to Liberia as an immigrant to plant fruits, including oranges, tangerine, and grapefruit, vegetables, and coffee, Robusta and Liberica. Those days, Liberia was known to be producing some of the best Robusta coffee. Anyway, he was one of the first to grow the pink grapefruit in Liberia, Mr. Best was. So once settled, once Mama, as we called her, a name of endearment, settled in Monrovia after Mr. Best's demise, she wasted no time getting into farming projects herself. She acquired lands along the St. Paul River, that the picture of which was shown to you by Shireen. And we started farming too, every imaginable thing, fruits, vegetables. She even raised pigs. And I remember when we would come back from the farm, in fact, in the yard at the house on Snapper Hill, we also started planting there. And we had a pig pen there, raising pigs as well. But whenever we slaughtered a pig, or whenever we came back with harvest from the farm, or even if we harvested from the farm in Monrovia on Broad Street, before we sat down to eat, my grandmother made sure that all the neighbors got a share of whatever we harvested. That's how it worked. She worked for more than 30 years, earning $67.66 as a nurse. But she raised 8 children just from her farming activities. And from the house was a huge house, more than 20 rooms, and she rented rooms to people. And it was through that she was able to educate all her children. This was replicated in Snapper Hill on the plot in Snapper Hill, as I said, the farming business. And so we were always full of food, and we were always able to help others who were less fortunate than ourselves. But although the best were now well entrenched in Monrovia, as far as Cruzerville was concerned, it was by no means permanent. Mama used every opportunity and justification, as we saw it, to quite often take the family up the river, up that St. Paul River, to spend time with Uncle Abel, or brother, as she called him fondly. They were extremely and acutely close. So while we loved the serenity and the climate up the river, being there was by no means a day at the beach, as Shireen would tell you. So it was by default that I, the first grandchild of my generation of Port and Best offsprings, and my cousins that followed, would end up in Cruzerville, often more than we could wish for, to be developed into men and women of tomorrow by Uncle Abbott, the chief disciplinarian. I can say without any reservation whatsoever that it was there during childhood and during adolescence that Christianity, the spirit of community, respect, honesty, tolerance, and forbearance were inculcated into each of the Port and Best offsprings. Moreover, Uncle Abbott was often in Monrovia, so there was no escaping that Bajan ethical grounding that had been passed down by generations to him. Actually, Snapper Hill was a city version of Cruzerville, as Uncle Abel's raft was omnipresent. Mama used to sit us on the stairs, and we had a big stairs in the front of the house in the evenings at sundown, and tell us stories about that she had been told by her grandparents about Barbados, about how they live there, about how everything they're doing now or then was what they used to do in Barbados, how they used to farm, how they used to go to church, how they used to embrace a sense of community and family. And it must have been in the 60s or 70s, a Mr. Best, who was a seaman from the Caribbean, showed up at our house one day. And because in Liberia, there's only one set of bests and only one set of ports, as is the case with the Barclays and Goodriches and everybody else, Wildeses and Weekses, you know, there's only one set. He showed up at our house on Snapper Hill and introduced himself and said he's our relative from the Caribbean. And he and Mama, his name was Keith Best, he and Mama became so close. Well, we all became so close with him. And I think he would actually try to make a strong effort to try to get assigned to come on the next sailing to Liberia. So we saw him at least twice, sometimes we were lucky 3 times a year. He would bring us chocolates and stuff. And I mean, he would stay on the ship at the Freeport of Monrovia, which was just about 10 minutes drive away from where we lived on Broad Street. But he would be at the house every day. And Mama would cook for him, would sit down, they would talk, she would write letters and he would take them back. And when he's come back, he would send letters. I don't know, I left to go to the States and Mama died. And but even before she died, he stopped coming. So we thought that he could only have passed away. And it was sad because we didn't have anything that connected us after that to the Caribbean, to Barbados or to Trinidad. We had lost everything. And so it was thankfully when Lois met these young ladies from Barbados who told her, Lois, you guys need to really start doing some research and try to trace your history, you know. And thankfully, Uncle Kenneth Best had done a book on Uncle Abbott, A Lifetime Trying to Save Liberia, in which he had documented a lot of, that's Uncle Abbott doing his writing in Cruiserville in his office. That's him and my grandmother, the day that, after the funeral of their father, Conrad Custard Port, when he died. He's buried also in the cemetery in Cruiserville, where we also have the grave of Matt, the tombstone of John Prince Port. There it is. Where he's buried. And so it's thanks in no small part to Lois's effort that we were able to complete, I'd say, the first part of the research, because there's so much that needs to be done. And this is the paper that we did last year. And when I came to Barbados, we presented a copy of it to the Prime Minister, Mr. Martin, which she highly appreciated. In fact, there I am presenting the paper to her, and she was very appreciative. In fact, she charged me. She says, Lorenzo, Barbadians need to know their history. They need to know where they came from. They need to know where their families are. So I'm asking you to please, 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 let's work together to get Barbadians to Liberia and Liberians to Barbados. And I should extend that. That's my cousin Rodney Port, when he was there for the Rodney Sear, rather. We all Ports. He was there for the inauguration of the wall recently, with our name Best and Blythe. And there's another one for the port as well, one of the bricks. But so she asked me, and I promised her that I will do that. We had planned also to do a family trip to Barbados this year, but with my retirement and my return from Switzerland to South Africa, things just got a little too difficult. But that's good because it gives us time to plan it for next year. And next year, we definitely plan to do that. But we will be coming back to Barbados. Rodney has been back to Barbados, I think 2 or 3 times since we were there. My work did not allow me to, but I'm in touch with people there in the Prime Minister's office and other parts of I'm in touch with the Ambassador of Barbados in Geneva. And we're working together to make sure that not only Liberia and Barbados, but Liberia, Barbados and Ghana and other countries, Nigeria, Cameroon, countries, Sierra Leone, that are also have this historical ties with Barbados, not in the same way we do, but because they were also countries that supplied slaves at the time to come to Barbados to work in those sugarcane plantations, who all came back. Some of them came back to Liberia. We will work to try to see if we can, and with what Shireen is doing, we'll try to work together to really make this thing happen and make the work that Arthur Padma was doing for so many years to make it a reality and plan a big event in Barbados. With this, on that note, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address this group.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. And thank you, Shireen and Carrie. Those presentations were very, very enlightening, very educational. What struck me were the shared values, the emphasis on education, on discipline, on hard work that those migrants brought over from Barbados and continue to instill in their families. We will now open the floor to any questions or comments. I think we already have some questions in the chat. We have Yvette. There are large Liberian diaspora communities in the US. Are there such communities in Barbados today? I personally do not know of any. Well, I guess what we will have in Barbados will be the original families, so the families that connect to those persons who went to Liberia. Do we have any Liberians who actually live in Barbados now? Shireen and Lorenzo, who did the research, did you encounter any of those in your research? Or Matt? Carrie?
I know there's I know there are a few Liberians who are in Barbados. I know that there's a Holder, Burley Holder's granddaughter is studying medicine in Barbados.
Okay, so basically not necessarily communities, but
No.
one of right. Okay.
Precisely. I also know a Liberian lady there in Barbados who actually was married to a Barbadian who worked in Liberia with the peacekeeping mission. And they went back there and she started a Liberian restaurant there in Barbados, in Christchurch. And we went there and she cooked some nice food for us. But she is a very, very, very popular place and she's doing very well there. I think she's Barbadian now. And she's well integrated. She's been there for at least 15 years now. So, but again, that's we need to take that to scale on both sides of the Atlantic. You know, we need to more. I know a lot of Liberians since I did the paper and from talking to people and some of the interviews that I have done. Many people are interested. Many Liberians are interested in coming to Barbados. And a lot of them were looking forward to being a part of this group we're putting together to come to Barbados this July, August. But like I said, we've had to put that forward to next year. And I'm sure the Prime Minister has promised me that she will make everything available to us, all logistics we need so that we can have make a big impact on the island and leave a lasting footprint that will encourage Barbadians to want to go to Africa, especially Liberia. Yeah.
I think we are looking forward to that. We have another question from Deborah Grant. She's asking on behalf of Ronnie Daniel in St. Vincent, can any of the panel presenters say how much, if any, would Garveyism may have influenced the Goodrich family in relocating? I think Garveyism would have been a little later, but in relocating to Liberia and their subsequent choice of careers and vocation. Was there any presence of Garveyism in Liberia?
I'm
Yes.
sorry.
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. Matt, or maybe Carrie?
Yes, thank you, Lorenzo. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, Garvey, in his Back to Africa plans for the diaspora, did look at Liberia specifically as a destination for the diaspora as to where they would go. And in fact, I've written an article for the Garvey Journal that looks at his interface with the members of the Barbadians, including Arthur Barclay, who was a part of the Garvey movement in the 1920s and so on. So Garvey did make contact with the Barbadians, and the Caribbean contingent in Liberia was in fact a part of his movement. It created the foundation of his movement. So maybe it's that Caribbean solidarity that was established in Liberia that Garvey was relying upon. But as you said, Ms. Pierce, Garvey is in the 20th century. These migrants are in the 19th century. So Garvey would not have influenced the Goodriches to migrate to Liberia, as the Goodriches came before Garvey. So if we're going to talk about the influence, it would be early Pan-Africanists, people like Martin Delaney and Cromwell and Blyden, who would talk about as influences.
Curry, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe when Garvey tried to come to Barbados to attract migrants, he wasn't even allowed to dock and present to Barbadians.
You're correct, Matt.
Okay. All right, just want to remind persons that they can ask your questions in the Q&A, or you can indicate, and you can actually ask your question on, you can speak on screen. So just let me know. Let me see if there are other questions in the, I saw there was one earlier from Facebook, but I'm not actually seeing it now. Perhaps Elena, would you want to resend that?
Harriet, it looks like there's a question from Marcia.
Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, there's another one here. All right, if you can see it, Matt, just go ahead. I'm not seeing it.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Marcia has her hand up and I believe she's been unmuted, so I think she can ask audibly.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Okay, Marcia, go ahead.
Hello to everyone. I just wanted to share that in 2019, I met a lady and her sisters who were visiting Barbados, and we actually had a very deep conversation with Sir Woodville Marshall. And she had planned to come here in 2020 with her family, booked a home and everything, to continue their research. Her ancestry is linked to the Weeks and Thorpes, who traveled in 1865 to Liberia. And I was very pleased to hear, I think it was Shireen mentioned the family as Shireen as well as Karine. I think they both mentioned both of those families as well as Lorenzo. And I am thrilled to have seen this presentation today and feel so blessed. And I did invite the lady I met, Aurelia, to be part of this, but obviously I can't see if she is there. If she is, perhaps Harriet, you can invite her. I don't want to disclose too much about their family, but certainly she's extremely active and with regards to bringing her entire family who are dispersed both in the United States and England into Barbados, and I believe Lorenzo knew them and knew that this was happening. I think he's the person who mentioned that they were to be here in 2020, but it was canceled. So thank you so much to the presenters for giving us such a valuable insight into the lives of persons who traveled on the Cora and their descendants.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcia. Yeah, well, we have the question from Facebook. Kojo Bando. Is Thompson and Norman also family names from the island? I think this is a general question and not necessary for Liberia. Are there any members of the Thompson family on the list from Cora, among those immigrants on the Cora? Is the Thompson family represented? Matt, Shireen, or?
The Thompson or the
Thompson. This person is asking about the Thompson and the Norman family.
I don't know about the Normans. I have no information about them being part of the group that went to Kosovo.
Okay, but Thompson is a common name in Barbados, not so much Norman. Norman is not a common name on our namescape at all. Okay, let's see if there are other questions. Let me just, okay. Where is, oh, this is Barbara Chase. Where exactly in St. Thomas were the ports who left on the Cora located?
That's a good question, and that's something that we are still investigating. According to the records we have, it said they were in Bridgetown, but when I visited based on the research we did, it was hard to pin that down because the last place he was known, John Prince Fort, was known to have lived and worked, was in Matt, you got to help me out here. Was on a plantation in, is it Greenfield, Matt?
Yeah, we don't know exactly. What we do, I think, in fact, Newlands might even be on the call, or he was earlier. We've tracked the location to St. Thomas somewhere, likely near the former town of Irishtown or Springvale, but we can't say for sure.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
So we will still need to do that. We still need, again, we hit a brick wall when we couldn't access information in the archives, just because the archives has all these, the records are available, but it's not just, they're just not accessible because of the state of the condition that the journals are in.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But they said that they named the church after Christ Church, Christ Episcopal Church. But I think when they moved down to Bridgetown before they trip to Liberia, I think they were Episcopalians, because we did go to a church while we were up in that area too, in Newlands. Not Newlands, when we went to Barbados, near where the plantation was. So they were Episcopalians, but there were no graves of any bests, no ports in there. So we're still working to find out precisely where they're from, where they lived.
Okay.
But again, you will see that after 1837, when slave trade was abolished, people were free to go wherever they wanted to go, and they were doing peace jobs here and there. So the record keeping was not good enough to have been able to track those people on the one hand. On the other hand, the slave owners, they concealed the and they birthed people, because some of them were not. It was a very dirty business they were doing, and so they have made it very difficult for us to trace our ancestry to our forebears and precisely where they were because their names were so different. It's a very onerous undertaking, really.
Mhm. We have, thanks, Lorenzo. We have a comment from Ophelia Weeks. She says, my great-grandparents were on the Cora. They were with their parents and were aged 6 and 8 years old. So here's another connection.
And Harriet, Ophelia Weeks, who just wrote that question, was the lady in the film that we put from the documentary.
Oh.
Yeah,
yeah.
so she probably missed her. But yes, Ophelia, that's the Ophelia Weeks.
Okay.
Who we just saw.
Well, it's nice that you mentioned the documentary because there have been some questions asking about the documentary, when it will be released and how persons will be able to access it. So
well, I can honestly tell you, I can't wait for this to come out. It's going to be fascinating because we have every generation from the few relatives we have in their 90s down to kids who are 7, 6, and 7 years old. And every continent, as I said before, we have people who are Barbadian descent now on every continent who are participating in the documentary. Our goal is to have it released by the end of this summer, and it will be available for everybody worldwide. So we'll probably get in touch with you and your organization because we want, especially the people in Barbados, to know what happened to their relatives. Where are they now? What are they doing? And I can promise you that there will be pleasantly surprised at the type of people who are participating in this documentary, the things they're doing, the contributions they're making worldwide. Is just going to be fascinating. So hang in there. We will make it accessible to everybody to see.
I look forward to that because it'll be very nice to have a forum like this where persons can not only view the documentary, but some discussion following the documentary. So I look forward to hear from you. Yes.
Harriet, I see there's a question from someone asking about, given the historical ties between the two countries, whether there are considerations about the establishment of diplomatic relations. I think there are. Indeed, the Prime Minister told me when we met that this was something, she was shocked, in fact, that it hadn't happened. She looked at the Foreign Minister and said, Foreign Minister, how is it that we don't have relations with Liberia? And he was like, well, I don't know. But I think, so to answer your question, sir, I think there are discussions that are going on through the normal diplomatic channels already for an exchange of notes and then leading to the eventual exchange of diplomatic emissaries between the two countries. But I think really that the time has come that we need to work towards making Cruiserville a UNESCO heritage site, World Heritage Site, because it is. And not only Cruiserville, but also Edina, which is hosting, as I mentioned earlier, the largest cemetery of Barbadians in the country. You know, that's something else that I think Matt and I have discussed, and through some of his, funding sources, these are things that we are looking into making happen, you know, and that will help to cement the relationship between the two countries.
That is all very interesting, Lorenzo. But what I was thinking as the presentations were going on, the possibility of a study tour. We're talking about, you know, from a diplomatic level and so on, but a study tour where we can organize a tour to Liberia to see where and how those persons lived, and you know, and really experience the connections for ourselves. So there are all kinds of possibilities.
Absolutely. Matt and I, sorry, go ahead, please.
No, you continue. You finish the point. Matt
and I have talked about that. I've also talked about that before when I was in Barbados. with the head of the archives. And she said, look, Lorenzo, it's good that we are doing this thing, but we need to get down there on the ground and see what's going on, see how we can really solidify this relationship, how we can bring the people to the theater, for want of a better expression, let them see, let them live it. And I was very appreciative of some of the pictures that Shireen were displayed, you know, and to the short film. We'll see more of that, but people really need to know. But that's a way of doing it, and I think through the Cultural and Heritage Foundation, I spoke to Minister John King as well about that when he was still Minister of Culture, and this was something we talked about that he wanted to make happen. So I know for sure that is on the government's radar. When I'm there next, I'm going to raise this. I also spoke with the head of the Carol Roberts, the head of the Cultural Foundation. We had lengthy discussions about that. So there are many things that are on this bucket list, but we just now need to get ourselves around it. You know, now that the independence and all these other activities that were more or less putting those things on the side have been now passed. We need to get around to doing some of these things now. You're right.
Okay, thank you. We have a Vid Powell who wants to ask a question, but before we allow him to ask, we have someone who's asking if there were other Bajans after the 1865 trip. Were there other Bajans who went to Liberia?
I don't know whether it was before or after, but I was just telling Matt before we started the session this evening, a friend of mine, a Liberian dentist who lives in and works in the States, in Michigan, I think, told me about how they went to bury his father, who had died. And when they went to their family cemetery, they found the grave of a lady who had been his father's wife before, who came from Barbados. And they didn't even know about her. That they just discovered that, you know, out of that. So I'm sure many, not many, there has to be instances of other people who came on their own, because people came on their own, and not only from Barbados, but also from Jamaica and other countries, you know, Cuba, all those places, you know. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if there are many, many other people there who also came from Barbados on their own before or after 1865.
To add to that, Lorenzo, yes, that is true. There were others who came to Liberia from Barbados, including some of the Greece people. During my research for the documentary, there were some Greeks who came to Liberia after the Cora ship, and there were others from the Caribbean. There were Haitians who came to Liberia, people from Trinidad and different places. But yes, we did have others from not on a large scale like the ones who came the initial trip, but there were individuals from Barbados who trickled into Liberia.
Okay, thank you. We have Mr. Powell, do you still want to ask your question? I have lost it in the chat. Do you wish to ask your question on air?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, it's actually Miss Powell. And to the comment that was just made, my lineage to Barbados actually happens to come from after the Cora into Liberia. But I have a milestone birthday coming up next week. And I have about 17 of my friends that are coming to Barbados. The main reason for that is to try to understand and reestablish our connection to Barbados. Some of the others on the trip do have lineage to Barbados. And first of all, thank you guys so much for this. This has been very informative and educational. I've been trying to study and research our ties and lineage to Barbados for quite some time now. So it'll be very, very refreshing to arrive there next week and see all of what I've been researching. But I'm wondering to the host and the panelists today, is it possible to connect with you guys once we're in Barbados next week so we can have more in-depth discussions about this?
Definitely. I think it's funny that you asked that question because I'm actually interviewing somebody who's going to your event, and I'm surprised now I'm piecing it together because they told me they were going to this. They say, I'm going to this thing in Barbados. I said, oh, well, we have to film you. You have to do a film in Barbados. So let's connect after this, and I would love to talk to you about your plans. I know how to get in touch with you. I know somebody who knows you. So after this, I will get in touch with that person and tell them how we can connect.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. To contact me, of course, I'm at the Barbados Museum. I just need to type I will just ask Elena to type my email address for me, library@barbmuse.org.bb. So you can, because I'm sure you will want to tour the museum.
Absolutely, that's actually on our list of things to do.
Yes, so you should contact us before with a group. You may want to have a guided tour and so on. So you have to make contact. There a different department that deals with that. So you can contact me at library@barbmuse. It's in the chat, and we can go from there. But I just want persons to know today that our panel is, Shireen is in Kansas City?
No, Delaware.
We're in Delaware, right. We have Matt in New York. We have Curry in Arkansas, and Lorenzo is in South Africa.
Yes.
So yes, so the interesting thing about Zoom is that we can make all of these connections and we can bring persons together to share their perspectives. We have, okay, Ray, do you wish to ask another question?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Oh, okay. All right, let's see if there are any other questions before we bring this to an end. Where did most of the former slaves from Africa to the, somewhere actually disappeared?
Oh, sorry, I was trying to answer the question. I don't know, I typed my answer and then went, but I can tell you it's Nigeria, mostly, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Cameroon. From my research, that's what I found out. I don't know if Kari, do you do anything more?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah.
Where did most of the slaves that came from, that went to Barbados came from in Africa?
Okay. I think you're right for the most part, but I think I would, for people who are interested in doing more in-depth research, I would point them to slavevoyages.org.
Mm-hmm.
That is the site that contains all of the transatlantic voyages from, well, most of the transatlantic voyages from Africa. And so you'd be able to see there. But Barbados, being one of the first colonies in the Caribbean, did receive most of the enslaved people from the Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra, which Lorenzo pointed out as what we now know as these current countries, Nigeria, Cameroon, and so on. So, but if you want to do your own research, slavevoyages.org would be the place to do it.
Thank you very much. And interestingly enough, at the end of last year, we did have a presentation coming out of that, the research from Slave Voyages, which looked at the Barbadians who captained or owned slave ships. And there were quite a few. Okay, we have some persons with their hands raised. Linda, would you like to make your submission?
Sorry, good evening, everybody. Nice to hear all the presentations. Some years ago, Matt had asked me to research some of the genealogy on the Barbadians that had gone on the Cora. And one of the families that he had given me at the time was the family of John Prince Port. And I pulled my file just now. They definitely were from Irish Town. And most of the marriages and baptisms of the children took place in Holy Innocents Church in St. Thomas. And there were, I think, if I remember correctly, there were 5 children that went with John Prince and his wife, Mary Elizabeth, to Liberia. But sometime afterwards, I was doing research for something else, and I came across an Elizabeth Jane Port who married a Robert Wilson, and her father was listed as John Prince Port. Now, she was not in the list of children that went. What I did not have here was whether that marriage took place in Barbados and she stayed here, or whether she was a later person that went after the ship, or there were 2 John Prince Ports. But I can look into that a bit more. But there was an Elizabeth Jane whose father was John Prince Port, who married this Robert Wilson, and she was about 30 and he was 31. And I think it was somewhere around 1863 that they got married. But I just need to check into that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Linda.
I think I may have come across that same information, and that's why it got sticky or confusing, because it put us at a deadlock. We couldn't decide one way or another. But yes, we do. I have baptismal certificates for a lot of the children in a Church of the Holy Innocents. One of the big mysteries we have is what happened to her. She wasn't on the ship. To his wife, she wasn't on the ship with him. We couldn't find any burial records for her.
Oh,
we couldn't find any divorce records for them, and she was a young woman, so we don't know what happened, so again, that's where we got stuck. We hit a brick wall and we couldn't go any further.
Okay.
Thank you, Linda and Lorenzo. Okay, time is getting away from us, so we have 2 persons. Vito Weeks, do you still wish to make your submission? Vito Weeks? If not, Marcia, you have a final word?
I just wanted to share that in researching that surname Port, what the folks may want to consider is to also research Fort, F-O-R-T-E, which was a very strong name in St. Thomas. And sometimes because of the literacy of the persons given information, and of course the attention being paid by the persons receiving that information, most of who were, if not all, were Anglican priests of European descent, they may have written a P and it was actually Fort, and the ancestry of the folks may actually lie within the lands of the Forts, F-O-R-T-E, who were very strong in St. Thomas. Irish tongue, yes, may play a role, but as we know, Irish tongue actually was very heavily populated at the period of the post-emancipation, early 1900s, by white Barbadians of Irish descent, as far as I know.
Exactly.
Not to say that they may not have been Black Barbadians who have ancestry that may have been owned by Irishmen, and therefore they took the name Port. But a cross-examination of the forts and the lands and plantations of the forts might yield some information. And the second thing I wanted to share was that the lady who shared about her ancestry being Terzar, Dorinda, it's actually Azelia Thorpe. She actually would be tied to the lady that I met in 2019 who had planned to be here in 2020, and a meeting took place between her and, of course, our renowned historian, Sir Woodville Marshall, coordinated by me at the archives, that they would be tied together. And in fact, what is very interesting about the Weeks and Thorpes is that I did take those folks up to Rock Hall, and the names, one of those surnames is on the plaque at Rock Hall as part of the original persons in St. Thomas in that free village. And that should help the lady with the Weeks and Thorpe connections. And I think St. Thomas seems to have been a parish where quite a number of people seem to have roots in St. Thomas who traveled on the Cora. So I hope that helps Lorenzo and all the other folks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you so much. Any final word? Sorry.
Yes, I have a final point to make. I've been getting some texts from people. A lot of people came on at the end of this. So could you please let them know that this whole presentation will be available on, I guess you said on YouTube.
On YouTube,
for those
yes.
who missed the beginning of it, and how they can get the link, because I think they've heard of, we've heard from your end a lot of valuable information. So if we can provide the link for people to go back and share this with others online or by email to be able to see the entire presentation, that will be great.
Okay, normally I send the link to persons on my mailing list once it's uploaded. Elena, our communications coordinator, will make any edits that are required and then upload and send me the link. But for persons who may not be on my mailing list, it will be on the Barbados Museum's YouTube channel. And there's actually a playlist for the genealogy group. So this will go into that playlist and you'll be able to see all the other presentations that were done for the genealogy group. Those on Zoom and those pre-Zoom when we started to do our Facebook Live. So Barbados Museum's YouTube channel, and it should be up by about next week. I would think, Elena, say about next week or so. All right. Any other final words? Matt, Carrie, Lorenzo?
No, I just want to say how appreciative I am to the museum for hosting this webinar. I think I see it as a one in a series because there's so much more to talk about. And now that we've opened this door, I think we need to keep it open. But I think it needs to be also bring on people from Barbados on the panel, the next coming panels, to talk more about what their own wishes are and what they would like to see, and what their views are with respect to their families on that side. I think it'll be very useful. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Lorenzo. Matt, Carrie?
Thank you, Harriet, for having me. This was really interesting and informative, and I'm just so thrilled that this, all this research is getting out there.
Thank you.
That's it for me as well. Just thank you.
Okay.
Thank you also.
Thank you. Well, my job is to thank you. I mean, it was wonderful. There's been a lot of information. I think people are not seeing it as, Barbadians who left here to go to Liberia, but you're actually seeing those connections in the shared values in architecture, in different aspects of their life, in the naming of their town, their buildings, and so on. So this has been tremendous, and we look forward to continued connections. So thank you, Carrie, Shireen, Matt, Lorenzo. Thank you all so much for agreeing to this presentation. I also want to thank the persons who participated on Zoom and on Facebook Live. Thank you so much for your questions and your comments. If you have any follow-up questions, just contact me at library@barbnews.org.bb. I also want to thank our communications coordinator, Elena, who is there in the background, keeping us on point. So thank you all so much. Our next meeting is scheduled for July 21st, and we are again continuing to look at connections. So Professor Don Scott will be speaking on the topic, exploring Barbados, South Carolina, historical, genealogical, and cultural connections. So that is Professor Scott on July 21st. So thanks again to our panelists, our participants, and I wish you all the best and be safe. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye. Bye.